Hey everybody, it's me, Ken Heckenlively with Twice as Lively. Welcome to episode 26. And the title of today's episode, book number 21 gets published. Yes, that's right. My 21st book is now officially available to order on Amazon. In fact, everything seems to be working just beautifully. So, with that being said, I have my beverage of choice, which is Peet's Coffee. It is a non-alcoholic drink. I encourage you to get your own favorite beverage. And as it is just the afternoon, I really encourage you, please try to make it a non-alcoholic drink. As our dear fallen leader Scott Adams taught us, we begin each episode with a simultaneous sip, a moment of unity between you and me. So, in honor of Scott, let's take that simultaneous sip. It is so good when that coffee hits the palate, that caffeine goes to the brain, and you just feel wonderful. Okay, so I haven't really talked a lot about my writing, but let me tell you a bit about the writer Kent Heckenlively and things you should probably know. As I mentioned, this book, which is publishing, is my 21st book. You should also know that I have 2 New York Times bestsellers, I believe 5 national bestsellers, because not every bestseller makes the New York Times bestseller list because they have a really strange way of counting book sales. And I have sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 750,000 copies of my books, and 2 of my books have been turned into documentary films, which are still unreleased. I am currently in the process of looking for book number 22 to be turned into a documentary. So you should just know I'm a pretty busy boy. But let's go to my book that we are discussing, book number 21. Here it is. This Never Happened, a call girl in DC. Now you may be wondering to yourself, what is your book about, Kent? Well, let me read from the summary of the book, as well as some of the wonderful, critical, advanced praise the book has already gotten. Heidi Scherzinger is just a typical working girl in Chicago in 1972. Well, maybe not so typical. In fact, she's running Chicago's most successful independent call girl outfit when she's summoned to meet with Sonny Battaglia, the country's most powerful mob boss. The other local call girl agencies are complaining about her success, so Sonny offers her a deal. Either she gets whacked or relocates to Washington, D.C., where she'll be working for the agency under the control of the creepy Sidney Gottschalk, the resident blackmail specialist. The agency wants to get blackmail material on all the horny Democrats who are flooding the Capitol in the run-up to the presidential election, trying to defeat President Nicholas Dixon running for a second term. The always efficient Heidi quickly sets up a first-class operation, aided by the quietly competent Milton Greenbaum, and what follows is a Florence Gump-type adventure through a 1970s Washington, D.C., which might be just a little different than the version you read about in your history books. Now, Let's talk about the critical praise that this book has received already prior to publication. So you can see right there, I'm reading off of the book. So it says, Heckenlively keeps the pages turning with brisk pacing and clever spins on hard-boiled dialogue. Entertainingly lurid. That's from Kirkus Reviews. From Blue Ink Review, readers will love the main characters, the ever-present suspense, and the unanswered questions that invite conversation about what is real and what is not. Jalen Carell from Independent Book Review writes, the stakes are high in Ken Heckenlively's This Never Happened, but the pleasure is definitely higher. Heckenlively hooks the reader with the romance and keeps them riveted with countless thrills in between. There wasn't a section I wasn't locked into. And from well-known author Jeffrey Yulin comes this review. Kent Heckenlively's new novel keeps you entertained from the get-go. More provocative and teasing than Pretty Woman, this political parody reimagines the Watergate scandal from the perspective of a whip-smart, opportunistic call girl who turns the tables on mobsters and spies, while changing the dynamics of history by seducing a bevy of famous figures. The writing is engaging and vivid. Hop into bed with Heidi and enjoy the ride. So, yes, this is the official launch week of my new book, This Never Happened, A Call Girl in DC. And I thought that today's episode, I would talk not just about the book, but maybe about some broader issues in fiction. So you should know that, unlike your typical conservative, I really consider myself a person of the arts. Yes, I love literature. I love the movies. I love culture. And when I look at what has gone on today, I think about how different it is than the cultural environment in which I grew up. As I mentioned before, I grew up in the 1960s, 1970s, and was a young man in the 1980s. And there was a sense that fiction and the arts would tell interesting, fun stories which would make you think. And not everything had to be depressing. In fact, it would be really good if you were entertained. And it seemed like artists of that era were interested in entertaining the hell out of you. And that's something that I wanted to create again. And I've mentioned before that I belong to two book clubs. And so these are, very serious readers. And what's been interesting to me is how much modern readers are just looking for a little bit of sunlight, a little bit of optimism, a little bit of fun in their storytelling. And so in putting together This Never Happened, I thought, how can I recreate some of the fun, the style of some of the fun stories that I remember in the past? Things like Gore Vidal would put together. Gore Vidal's books were very funny. Other authors of the time, would, like Elmore Leonard, they would tell stories of small-time crooks going after big crooks. You had the novels of Jacqueline Suzanne, Harold Robbins, which were rich people doing bad things at the same time that they were looking gorgeous and handsome. And there was just sort of a certain style that that I feel like is missing in so much of what we see today. And in so much of what we see today, not just in fiction, but in the movies, is, and I hate to say it, we got a lot of ugliness. And I thought, how about bringing some style, beauty, attractiveness back into storytelling. So that's what I did in putting together this story. I also wanted to confront this idea of women in the 1970s were engaged in the women's liberation movement. And what I remember from those times, and specifically also from my mother, who really was one of the pioneers for women getting education, is that as much as the women were pressing back against structures which had kept them down for many years, they also seemed to really like men. I mean, I can't put it any other way, which was the movement of women into greater society was not accompanied by a dislike of men. In fact, if anything, what they were doing was to meet men as their equal. And I remember it as just like a wonderful time when I would say to myself, God, it's great that women are coming into the workforce. It's great that women are being allowed into professions that were previously the the domain of men, and women were bringing something different. And I think that whenever you have an area of life which is, pretty much exclusively occupied by one sex, I think that the opposite sex coming into that field will have different perspectives, and so that was wonderful. So it was there was this movement for freedom, but it didn't seem to be accompanied by the hate and dislike which seems so common in our discussions today. And so uh, the other thing I thought I would do is I wanted to take you, the viewer, kind of behind the scenes of how a writer goes about creating a story. So for me, one of the stories in history that I've always been intrigued by is the Watergate scandal. I was, approximately 11 or 12 years old when the Watergate scandal broke. I remember very vividly that the Watergate hearings were on constantly in my family's house. I would sit and watch them. And it was really sort of my introduction to the political world. So the story was very important to me. But one of the things that had happened in the course of my writing my previous 20 books is I've written about the CIA, and I investigated the Watergate scandal again. And I found that there were many anomalies to the story. And it made me think that those anomalies would be good places to hang a fictional story. So let me just say right at the outset, this never happened. A call girl in DC is fiction. The way I have it written is it's kind of like, oh, is this true? Is it not? Okay. Let me just say from the outside, it's a work of fiction. But there are some real unanswered questions from the Watergate scandal, which I use in putting together the framework of the story. So before I go too far, what I want to do is I just want to read from the acknowledgments of some of the books that I consulted in putting together This Never Happened. So this is the acknowledgments at the end of the book. And it says, in putting together this fictional story, I'd like to thank some nonfiction writers and their books, which have given me a new perspective on the Watergate scandal of the 1970s, which was my political awakening as a young boy who sat glued to the Senate hearings. For your own edification, I highly recommend Chaos by Tom O'Neill and Dan Piepenbring, Silent Coup by Len Kolodny and Robert Getlin, Secret Agenda by Jim Huff, Tricky Dick by Roger Stone and Mike Colapietro, Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer, Haig's Coup by Ray Locker, White House Call Girl by Phil Stanford, Bond of Secrecy, as well as Dorothy by St. John Hunt. And for fun, I suggest you read Lovers Are Losers or any of the other 38 novels written by E. Howard Hunt. The older I get, the less confident I am that I know anything about the world. Okay, so these are books which have been published in recent decades, which take a different look at the Watergate scandal and specifically what was going on in the 1970s. Now, most of it revolves around the actions of the CIA and the FBI and what they were doing in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, in the wake of Vietnam, and in the presence of the Nixon presidency, which in the retelling of these other authors, these alternative history authors, I would say, or an alternative opinion about what was going on, is that Richard Nixon was really seeking to break the control of the Central Intelligence Agency and replace that with the National Security Council, something that the CIA was very interested in stopping. Nixon, as a communist hawk, was also interested in détente with the Soviet Union and China and lowering tensions. And the claim of these authors, at least, is that the Central Intelligence Agency and many parts of the Pentagon and defense contractors were not really interested in Nixon lowering tensions. So that was a little bit of the backdrop upon which I framed the This Never Happened novel. But there was another little detail which, when I read about it, just bugged the living shit out of me. And here it is. The Watergate burglars. What do we really know about the Watergate burglars? Well, first of all, what we know is most of them were former CIA officers. So the question is, what are CIA officers doing breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the behest of the Nixon White House? Interesting question. Is there a question of divided loyalty? Is there a question as to whether they were working on behalf of the CIA or were they working on behalf of Nixon, which is the generally accepted history? But the generally accepted history has some questions to it, such as the fact that so many of the Watergate burglars, I think it was 6 out of the 7, had very clear CIA ties. And there was something about the burglaries themselves which was very suspect. So every account agrees that there were actually 2 break-ins to the Democratic National Headquarters. The first went in and they planted 2 bugs. And the curious thing about that is that one bug was planted in the phone of the head of the Democratic National Committee, which makes a lot of sense, right? So you want to get dirt on the opposition? Well, you want to bug the phone of the most important person of the opposition, which would be, at that time, the head of the Democratic National Committee. The other phone, however, presents some problems because the phone which was bugged was the phone of a secretary. And in preparation for today's broadcast, what I actually did was did a little bit of research just to remind me about it. So you can find this article on Justia. It's about Ida Maxwell Wells, plaintiff appellant, versus G. Gordon Liddy. This is one of the Watergate burglars, arguably the second in command after E. Howard Hunt. And if you look at the Watergate scandal through this perspective, it seems much different. Now, is this version true? I have no idea. That's why I wrote my book as a fictional story and not as truth, not as nonfiction. So, my book is absolute fiction. Let's be really clear about that. But the question is, maybe it's not that far from reality. So, let me just read from this case because this may be completely different than all of us thought about it. So let me just read the court's summary of the case. Ida Maxie Wells, who was a secretary at the Democratic National Committee, DNC, for a short time in 1972, filed a defamation action against G. Gordon Liddy, stemming from his advocacy of an alternative theory explaining the purpose of the June 17, 1972 Watergate break-in. During several public appearances and on a worldwide website, Liddy stated that the burglars' objective during the Watergate break-in was to determine whether the Democrats possessed information embarrassing to John Dean. More specifically, Liddy asserted that the burglars were seeking a compromising photograph of Dean's fiancée that was located in Wells' desks, among several photographs that were used to offer prostitution services to out-of-town guests. So, in other words, the fiancée of the Attorney General was alleged to be working for a high-class call girl operation that was working out of the Democratic National Committee. And the more you look into these alternative theories, the spicier it becomes, because the claim is that actually the call girl ring was run by the CIA. So the question is, what is happening? Why are these former CIA agents bugging the phone of their own call girl operation operating out of the Democratic National Headquarters? Well, the question is whether various parts of the CIA were at odds with each other. Were there some people at the CIA who were the Watergate burglars who were more in the Nixon camp of wanting to lower tensions with the Soviet Union, break the power of the CIA? And was the CIA itself trying to get information which would both, on the one hand, help Nixon, and yet, on the other hand, lead to the CIA having control over Nixon? That's kind of a crazy, nutty claim, right? That's why I didn't write this book as nonfiction. I leave that to others. But I thought in creating my fictional political scandal, I could use the skeleton of that argument to put it together. So all of these things started circulating through my mind. Also, if you read accounts of the 1960s and 1970s in our political system, what becomes clear is how large of a role the mafia played in our political system. So it is acknowledged by everybody that our own CIA worked with the mafia, specifically Sam Giancana's group out of Chicago, as well as Santo Trafficante out of Florida, Carlos Marcello out of New Orleans. And the question is, how deep did those ties go? And so it really seemed that there were multiple operations between the CIA and the mafia, stretching back to World War II, actually, because with Lucky Luciano, in which the mob was working with our intelligence agencies to fight first against the Nazis and then against the communists. And so the question is, how much were our intelligence agencies working with the mafia, as well as significant questions about how much our elected officials were. One of the things that the Nixon administration did was they commuted the sentence of union boss Jimmy Hoffa, who had been working with the mob. So there's also a question of how much the Nixon administration, through some cutouts, was working with the mob. All of that, I thought, just combined to create a really interesting set of circumstances which would be ripe for a fictional story. As I said before, This Never Happened is a work of fiction, but there are some very significant questions which I think are raised by the actual history of Watergate and my story, which is how much do we, as members of a democracy, actually have control over what's going on? And how much is being manipulated by outside influences, maybe the intelligence agencies, maybe the mafia? And the question is, in this world where there are so many powerful malign forces, what chance does any real nice citizen, what chance does any regular person have to genuinely affect the outcome in a positive way? I felt that that was a very interesting path to follow for me as a writer, and hopefully it would be fun for you as a reader. The other thing that I think prevents the public from learning more about the Watergate story is it's always seemed to me to be a story of gray, uninteresting men. And for guys, I think that that is really okay to follow. We will follow the stories of men who are trying to get power, but the world is only half men. There are women involved in the world, and I thought it would be interesting also to focus on some of the women of the story. So the supposed madam of this call girl ring, which was allegedly operating out of the Democratic National Headquarters, was named Heidi Reekin, and she is profiled in the book White House Call Girl, which I encourage all of you to get to read in order to understand some of the unanswered questions which still remain about Watergate. There were also some other figures who, when I researched them, I found very interesting. E. Howard Hunt was quite an interesting character. In addition to being the leader of the Watergate burglars, he was also a well-noted and well-known mystery and crime writer. He wrote several novels, several detective novels, and is allegedly the model for Ethan Hunt in the Mission Impossible series. I found that fascinating. I also found fascinating looking at the wives. Dorothy Hunt, Howard's wife, who died very mysteriously in a plane crash in Chicago, where she was bringing money to some of the Watergate burglars. Oh, that's not suspicious at all, right? Yeah, planes always crash when you got a bunch of money on you, right? She was a fascinating figure, and her son, St. John Hunt, has written a book about his mother, and as I freely acknowledge, that was one of the books that I consulted as well. So I wrote This Never Happened, to Call Girl in DC, to give you a different perspective on the Watergate scandal. And in terms of what we are learning more and more today about the work of the CIA and our intelligence agencies, shadowy figures like Jeffrey Epstein, I think that This Never Happened to Call Girl in DC is the perfect summer read for you to enjoy just as a story, and yet hopefully will cause you to ask some deeper questions. And after the summer fun is over, maybe you'll take a little bit of time to research the Watergate story a little more closely and come to your own decision about what you think really happened in that scandal, which removed not just a president, but a vice president of the United States and put two unelected officials in the highest offices of the land. So, with that being said, I hope you'll have a great summer. I hope you're going to go on some great vacation, and hopefully, you'll take along a copy of my book, This Never Happened, A Call Girl in DC, because you're looking forward to sitting on a beach somewhere and having a fun, thoughtful read. All right. Have a great day, everybody.